Bonjour, merci d'être présent pour cette session qui s'annonce riche cet après-midi. Cette session, on l'a pensée vraiment autour de la question des archives et de la restauration. Quelle est la place de la restauration dans la création, avec, on va dire, deux perspectives principales. L'une qui est la restauration elle-même. Est-elle une création? C'est une question assez polémique. Surtout, comme vous le savez probablement pour beaucoup d'entre vous, par rapport au nouveau code d'éthique qui sera présenté à l'Assemblée générale pour le vote. Donc, c'est aussi une des raisons pour lesquelles c'est très important d'avoir cette présentation aujourd'hui. Et puis ensuite, eh bien, nous aurons une présentation plutôt sur la réappropriation et la création à partir de restauration, comment l'archive peut être en fait donc à l'initiative de nouvelles créations et comment son rôle donc permet aussi de pouvoir inciter des créations. Puis nous aurons aussi une présentation d'une restauratrice. Malheureusement, donc la troisième présentation qui était prévue n'aura pas lieu parce que les personnes n'ont pas pu être présentes aujourd'hui. Voilà. Donc, I will present briefly the first participants. There are two. Jeanne Pommeau, she's a film curator in Narodny Film Archive since 2004, and she's really involved in the restoration ethics since a long time, and she's also a student in PhD in Paris 8, and she's also really working about tinting and toning, the real tinting and toning techniques, and how to get them today with the actual technological context. Peter Bagrov is a film historian. You all know about him because he's the FIAF president. He's archivist and since 2019 senior curator of George Eastman House, a museum, and director of the Selznick School. So it's really important because the educational field is also really important in this question of how you teach how to restore a film. And both of them were actively involved in the editorial group of revision of the Code of Ethics. So, thank you, Jeanne and Peter.
Hello. Thanks. Good afternoon. So, by the way, as you can see, the title of our presentation is slightly different from the one you have in the program. And the main, very important difference is that here we see that there's a question mark, which is an essential thing. And we had a long discussion about whether it should be a question mark, an exclamation mark, or whatever it should be. But we felt that it is, sadly, a very appropriate topic for this symposium. Let's start with some formalities and the question of language, which is essential here.
So among the articles revised in the Code of Ethics, some address the relationship between restoration and creation. And so in the current Code of Ethics, as Caroline and I pointed out in Lausanne a few years ago, Article 1.5 raised concerns regarding the creative dimension of the work, So when restoring materials, archives will endeavor only to complete what is incomplete. They will not seek to change or distort the nature of the original materials or the intentions of their creators. In the French translation, the word only was omitted entirely, resulting in the phrase archives will endeavor to complete what is incomplete, which these interpretations, of course, opens the door to a highly creative approach. Another issue we highlighted in Lausanne concerns the concept of the creator's intentions, which is, of course, a highly abstract notion that can easily give way to subjective interpretations or imagination. So in the proposed revision, we have these articles, and the article that is at the core of our concerns in this contribution is a newly introduced Article 1.7, which states restorations and reconstruction are not acts of creation. While this may seem self-evident, practices both within and outside FIAF can at times blur this distinction, leading to confusion in the field.
Before we go to the next one,
Yeah.
I would like you to pay attention to 1.6, the thing that we highlighted in green. And again, this hasn't been approved by FIAF yet. It's a proposed, even though a large group of archivists contributed to this, so that our affiliates should resist any temptation or pressure to deliberately modify the work. Please remember this because we will refer to this later.
So when discussing the new presentation of an old film, we often encounter a wide range of terminology. Some of these terms describe the outcome of the interventions, others refers to the procedures used, while some focus on the intended aims of such activities. Many of these words are strongly associated with creation and transformation, making it very difficult to clearly identify restoration ethics within these practices or fully understand what is presented to us. There are numerous of definitions of what constitutes restoration issued by international organizations as ICOM, ECHO, as well by theorists, historians, and archivists. Here are some examples. So at first glance, it may appear that each definition brings something new because they are different. However, when we compare them, we find obvious recurring themes, respect for the original, consideration of historical and physical conditions, preservation of authenticity, and of course, none of these definitions leave room for creation, even for creativity. So, creativity is not necessarily alien to the nature of an archivist that can occur during creative programming projects for begetting films, as we have seen in the morning. However, referring to Venice Charter, which also primarily focused on architecture, remains highly relevant, we find the clear principle that restoration must stop at the point where conjecture begins. In contrast, creation is defined as the act of bringing something entirely new into existence. It may seem too obvious to be said, but that restoration involves returning to the original, the old, while creation entails making something new. Yet, in practice, the distinction is far from obvious. Outside the Federation community, and at times even within it, the boundary between restoration and creation has not always been clearly respected. Peter loves examples, so I will hand it over to him.
Yeah, so now we start, as one colleague said, now you will have the pornographic part of your presentation. The thing is with examples, we had a serious moral dilemma. We think that there are many things done by FIAF affiliates, which does not exclude us, that are very dubious. We didn't want to turn this into a shaming session. So we are not going to quote all of the bad examples we'd be given, either from our own practices And Jeanne very wisely said, well, ours is a very boring one. And I think we don't go too far, or from commercial enterprises. But there are examples in other parts of our field, unfortunately, and sometimes it's a very difficult decision to make. The first one would be actually from the George Eastman Museum, a reconstruction of a 1915 Western we're currently working on. So how to deal with decomposing or missing sections of a film, especially when you have multiple elements. And in this case, we had a nitrate which had both decomposition and many, many splices. So we could leave it as is, which would mean that some footage is missing, some footage is barely visible. And the big dilemma here is, what are we trying to restore? Because there is the materiality, it's a moving, it's an image, it's a visual art, and there is the narrative, which also should be preserved. And sometimes they're in conflict with each other. One simple example here, so we filled all the missing gaps of a nitrate with other prints, including many 16mm prints, which are cropped. So if you don't resize anything and try not to lose any image, this is what you would have. Which is quite disturbing. And the way of dealing with it would be just to crop everything, resizing it to the size of the smallest element, which is the compromise that we made, and I'm not saying this was the perfect decision. So yeah, this is how it looks now. I mean, in better resolution when projected from a DCP or a print. Of course, another option was to leave the nitrate full frame, not lose this part of the image, but to have some gaps in the middle and have some very badly decomposed sections, which again would not be true to the authenticity. We don't think that this is creation yet, but it already was some kind of a decision of what to let go.
Erasing defects digitally is a standard practice in film restoration. Excessive cleaning, smoothing, or noise reduction removes the texture and materiality of the original film and can erase some marks of the technologies of the time. Digital artifacts may occur in excessive digital cleaning. We know all that, we practice that. So where does the restorer determine the limits of it? When does reinterpretation start? And it's also a question we have in reconstruction. So there are an example of a reconstruction of a technique, that is not possible to reintroduce with a creative approach to color grading.
Yeah, so inventing materiality. In this case, it's an example from an archive where I used to work, Gosfilmefond. It's an early color, because color came very late to the USSR, Soviet film, for which the only existing element is the camera negative, and it's a color separation system very similar to Technicolor and probably largely stolen from it. So when the nitrate negative was scanned, the images were combined, and this is what you get. I do want to say that this happened before I joined the archive, because probably this was a little bit too much. Not this yet, but then there was the grading with no references, because there wasn't a single print. And as a result, this is how the image looked. Now, fairly recently, 5 years ago, so we encountered some existing frames from this film, which were scanned and which are currently at the George Eastman Museum, and they look somewhat differently. And again, of course, for animation, I think it's an essential thing. And you know, there are ways of dealing with this, I think, a bit more appropriately. You can look at other prints made at the same studio, in the same lab, and have it slightly more similar, but the approach here was clearly very creative. And this is where the restorer becomes the co-author, you know, of the filmmaker. So another example, this one is from the George Eastman Museum. So 30 years of motion pictures, a film that we preserved, I think quite decently, because it was before my day, so I can praise this restoration. There was one interesting dilemma there. It's a film that shows the achievements of the film industry including the technical achievements and the color. And there was a section dedicated to The Black Pirate, which was a very new film, made in 1926, and this compilation film was made in 1927. The problem was that in the print, which was the only original print, this whole Technicolor section was very badly faded. And the whole point of including it in the 30 years of motion pictures was to showcase Technicolor. So the idea was to substitute it with a fragment of an original print, a scan, which existed the BFI. The problem was that in 30 years of motion pictures, they used the A negative, print made from an A negative, whereas the BFI had the B and C negatives. So the change was made, but as you can see, the takes are different. In this case, not dramatically different, but different still. In some cases, as we know, with Murnau's Sunrise and other things, they are basically two different films made from different negatives. Of course, it is very prominently acknowledged in the opening credits. Well, this is not a restoration of a 1927 film, it's a reconstruction, and we used the BFI fragment, which is from a different negative. But again, it was sort of a creation of a thing where it was decided and it was a compromise, and I'm not saying it was a perfect one, and there is no such thing as a perfect compromise, of saving the sort of the idea of showcasing the color, but having a somewhat different footage. Yeah. So the next example is actually not from our two archives, but it is not shaming because I think it's it's example of a very proper credit of a compromise. It was a joint project done by the iFilm Museum and the Library of Congress just around the corner, which was shown in Pordenone several years ago. And so the semiotic sort of, semantics rather, of our colors here, we highlight the dubious things in red, and the thing that we praise in green. So the one thing that was somewhat problematic is that since the domestic version held at Library of Congress contains the better takes, these were preferred. And then the question is, how do we determine what is better? Which is a completely subjective approach. This being said, and this is from a publication from the iFilm Museum's website from one of their programs, this combination of different shots and takes cannot be considered to represent the original version. And again, when you're transparent about these things, this actually makes it a much more, an easier decision. And besides, there was no complete version of either the domestic or the foreign negative. And not very often do you have this language, because very often when such a reconstruction is being made, then the archives claim that they have finally restored the original.
So then here we have a very, very, very creative approach, actually. But fortunately, it's not called a restoration at all. But nowadays, there is, in Las Vegas, there is a cinema sphere screen. And the Wizard of Oz was adapted in the way that there is like more images on the side. So according to the website Swear Entertainment, we can read that the original 1939 films will be presented as a fully immersive experience for Sphere. And Sphere will use cutting-edge technologies to enhance the original film. The Wizard of Oz will maintain the integrity of the original while pushing the boundaries of Sphere's experimental medium. So there is, of course, like the big problems that this is the biggest screen. It's a 16K laid screen. So the resolution was very much enhanced, and there is also the pans that were combined in order to be one shot, and to keep all the elements together in what they called in the Google blog hyper-realistic detail. So this is an adaptation for new technologies that can become very, very extreme in terms of creativity. In a totally different, so this is really like the extreme where we are going to nowadays. We can see this kind of experience made with all films. in a totally different approach. This image is from the wonderful talk Wim Wenders made at the Cinémathèque Française a few years ago during Toute la Mémoire du Monde festival. He explained in detail what he did to make the goalkeeper's fear of the penalty available again, because the film was not it was not possible to see it again. Because back then, when the film was made in 1971, the production had only secured a 2 years license to use rock standards by artists like Elvis Presley and others. And since those rights had long expired, and with the costs of licensing being prohibitively high, vendors made the decision to remove the original music, as you see in the image. The part is removed from the soundtrack. It corresponds to the music of the film, and replace it with new pieces of music, carefully chosen to match or produced to match the style of the standards used in the original version of the work. So directors have the right to revisit, modify, and adapt their films. That's called a new version. There is a long-standing tradition of directors releasing new versions of their works. It's always totally possible, and it's always valuable when they clearly explain the way Wim Wenders did what was changed and why. As archivists, we care about two main things in this case. First, ensuring that the original version continues to be preserved and exist for the future. Ideally, both versions will remain accessible in the future. Second thing is recognizing this is as a creative act, a new version of the film, but not a restoration. So in the proposed code of ethics, we have restoration and reconstruction are not acts of creation. The result of such activities is not to be deemed a new work. But of course, the filmmakers we can reverse it. The filmmakers can make a new version of their works. The result of such activity is not to be deemed a restoration.
So here's another example of inventing the narrative, also from my Gosfilmefond years. This is the very first Soviet color film, Carnival of Flowers, of colors, because there was like a wordplay in the Russian title. So what happened is the film, it's a sound film, but it was filmed silent, and so the negatives are full-frame silent negatives. And when they were scanned, the restorer saw in the left image this man who is looking at the camera, somewhat perplexed and is showing, I think, his fist. That's the director of the film. You are not supposed to see him, of course, because that part was covered by the soundtrack. But he did exactly what we're trying to suggest against in the Code of Ethics. He could not resist the temptation of leaving him in the film, because it's actually quite fun when he moves and instructs, and completely breaks the composition. It is great fun. I would have clearly edited as like a supplement on a DVD or something. But the thing is, of course, he couldn't have the framing move all the time, like we showed in the William S. Hart example. So the framing was silent in every other section of the film. And the right image, the idea was to show how still paintings and the colors of them are reproduced in color moving images. You are not supposed to see anything other than the painting. And you see this left side, with a part of the frame. So this creative idea and the temptation led to a complete disbalance of compositions. So it changed the narrative, because this important and extremely interesting character was not supposed to be in the film. And it also changed the materiality as well. And in fact, this materiality versus narrative, here is another William S. Hart example, which I will play and talk while I am playing it here. In this case, there was no proper reframing in terms of cropped images. But you see that it goes from nitrate to mediocre 35 to an obvious 16 millimeter. And the way it looks right now, it could be properly graded, of course, and look a little better. The jumps in the image quality are quite substantial and very distractive. And then the discussion that we have here, what is more intrusive? If we do it like this, and then of course like grade it accordingly, but we see this pulsation of image quality, or let's say we leave just the perfect nitrate with the gaps. So in that case, the materiality is there. You can see the beautiful cinematography and the details, but you would see certain jumps in action. And in fact, but this being said, sometimes doing less means being creative. So here's an example from one of the most canonical Soviet films, one of the most canonical films of all time, Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible. If you remember, the second part is black and white, and it has one color section. And then it goes to black and white again. So there are scenes in there's this huge sort of orgy, basically a feast. Then there is a religious procession that goes into the outside, then near the monastery, and then in the cathedral, the new black and white shot. We see this rough transition from color to black and white. That's the way the film is always being screened. So luckily, several years ago, I was able to find a couple of frames from the selection of frames from the original film. This is how it originally was. So color was so important to Eisenstein. To make this transition, it was a dramatic, of course, move from color to black and white. He tinted a shot, which was never used in Soviet cinema in the 30s and 40s at all. And of course, the negatives were black and white. So when the only nitrate print was destroyed, now black and white prints are being made from that scene, and he was one of the very important theorists of color. So I think that in this case, by doing less, but by not applying the tinting, we're actually creatively distorting the film.
Yeah, we questioned the issues with narration and materiality. Let's question the tools also. Restorers are using tools that were most of the time originally designed for production or post-production, and primarily for creative purposes, from scanners to cleaning tools. Almost everything is derived from the needs of production companies. So the majority of the workflows in digital restoration relies on technologies that were originally developed for the post-productions of new films or for creative works. Tasks like removing an electric pole from a second set in the 15th century, enhancing colors, correcting lighting from a shot, or creating VFX. Those tools were made for creation, even so they can adapt well to the needs of film restoration. The possibilities they offer are often far more extensive than that it is necessary for simple return to the film to its original state. And there is a strong temptation, again, to modify the work beyond its original form just because the tools are making it possible. On the other hand, digital projectors are unable to provide the correct speed for silent films that were shot and screened at least at less than 24 frames per second, because it's not a priority for the current industry's needs. So as a result, the tools available are not entirely suited for restoring films to their original authentic states. Okay, and here is what we see. A lot of us see that.
Is it possible to play both at the same time, clips?
Thank you. So this is like what we can see very often, like awful, totally like use of artificial intelligence in the manipulation of images. It raised concerns, of course, about the look, the way we will receive films, and people are receiving films, and also about losing human control and expertise over archival material. Artificial intelligence, by its very nature, compiles and normalizes existing data, leading to an uniformity of images. As a result, everything starts to look the same, erasing the unique characteristic of different film stock, doing strange, like cats sometimes. So we are erasing not only the distinct way films were shot and processed and printed, but the reality is also very, very disturbed. The process ultimately contributes to the deshistorization of films, stripping away their individuality and historical context.
This being said, at least in this video that went sort of viral, unfortunately, on YouTube of Le Déjeuner de Minuit, it is promoted as the colorization of a film. In this case, here is an example of a great discovery of a colored footage of The Merry Widow. And these are the real YouTube comments. Do the people at UCLA, there are a couple here, Film and Television Archives know about this footage? It's been lost for decades and now it's found. Then, of course, the pathetic ones, we didn't need words, we had faces. And the one I love the most, because there were some decent people who were able to recognize that it's completely fake, was that, colorized or not, this is wonderful to see. So in this case, and this, indeed, people think that it is a discovery of the actual color footage from Erich von Stroheim. So here we are. We will rush through the last couple of them just to...
So ironically, contemporary film productions often embrace the grain of film, the film look of film, while the materiality of film is frequently denied in presentation of all films or distorted, as we have seen. It is highly valued in new films, even when shot digitally. One recent practice in post-production involves shooting digital images onto film to capture the softness and grain of the film material before scanning it back into digital format. So shot in digital, screen in digital, but going through film. This digital to film to digital process reflects the industry's desire to return film materiality on screen. So there is a paradox here that while many new films strive for a more photochemical appearance, older films are often denied the opportunity to regain their original photochemical look under the pretext of embracing modernity and satisfying the creativity of enthusiasts. Which one we don't know exactly. Maybe the one that say that it's wonderful in any case, with or without colors.
Yeah, the better they look, the worse they are. The more convincing they are, the worse they are. So we got the red card, but we have just a couple more pictures to show. So great examples always come from Disney. So what is the aim of restoration? Is it to go back to the original, or is it to improve or enhance the film? So here Disney enhances the image. On the left we see a scan of the nitrate frame from the Eastman Museum. It was probably done by Barbara Flukiger for her project, I guess. On the right it's sort of the way it circulates now. I'm not going to comment on this, I think it's pretty obvious. But also Disney is much more inventive, and they do actually also enhance or improve the narrative. So Fantasia has some racially problematic images, and I have to say that I sort of admire the inventiveness of Disney of getting rid of these characters, either by reframing or by completely erasing the character. We don't have to show it, time to show it in motion in the upper pair of images. And indeed, and this is done pretty convincingly, unlike the Merry Widow or the cat example. So, and indeed, there is a new generation of kids, including mine, who only see this film in this version. So shouldn't archives be a safe place for audiovisual materials?
In the time of augmented and virtual realities, modification of archival material without critical edition is contributing to the spread of an alternative reality we see too much these times. And
there is enough chaos in the world already. Film archive should not contribute to it.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for this exciting presentation with these beautiful examples, a lot of beautiful images and examples that were shown and that were really like speaking by themselves. ahora vamos a acoger a Tania López Espinal, quien está trabajando en el área de preservación fílmica desde 2016 y ahora en Cineteca Nacional de México. Está trabajando es la responsable del Archivo Memoria, un proyecto, y también es directora del colectivo del Día del Cine Casero, que tiene como misión de promover preservación, proyección y historia de todo el cine casero y también de las películas huérfanas. Y va a ser una presentación sobre cómo, cuál es el papel del archivo en también la creación y también es otra relación con los creadores, que une un poquito las dos presentaciones, porque en los dos casos pues, son los papeles del archivo enfrente de la creación que están en cuestión. Muchas gracias, Tania.
Gracias. Hola a todos, todas, todes. Bueno, pues voy a empezar solo para contextualizar un poco de qué es Archivo Memoria. Y en 2010, Audrey Young comenzó el programa Archivo Memoria en la Cineteca Nacional y fue bajo la dirección de Paula Astorga. El proyecto está dedicado a la preservación, digitalización, catalogación y difusión de películas en pequeños formatos, 16 milímetros, 9.5, 8 y super 8 milímetros, con filmaciones de películas familiares, cine experimental y amateur, registro de disciplinas, cine educacional, animaciones, filmaciones antropológicas, entre otros. Este fue el primer proyecto de esta índole en México, dando pauta a otras instituciones y archivos fílmicos para resguardar este tipo de material. Cada una de estas expresiones son un reflejo del contexto sociocultural donde fueron creadas y juntas construyen un reflejo de la sociedad mexicana. Estas filmaciones demuestran la interacción entre familias, la urbanidad y la disposición social. El programa Archivo Memoria alberga aproximadamente 237 colecciones con aproximadamente 6,000 rollos de diferentes formatos fílmicos. La temporalidad de los materiales abarca desde 1920 hasta el 2012. El proyecto tiene la finalidad de reinterpretar y compartir el archivo fílmico como un lugar para la creación, activando nuevos proyectos de investigación, reapropiación y montaje de las imágenes en movimiento, agregando nuevos valores simbólicos y estéticos. Vinculado a esto, se ha realizado la celebración del Día del Cine Casero desde el 2015 en Cineteca Nacional, en diferentes dinámicas, invitando al público en general a traer sus materiales fílmicos para ayudarles a revisarlos, proyectarlos y compartiendo una guía básica para su preservación en casa, si así lo desean, o que los puedan donar a la Cineteca. En pandemia se realizó online con ediciones de colecciones que ingresaron ese año al programa y en otras ocasiones se realizaron proyecciones de material con memoria oral de los asistentes y o con improvisación sonora también. Tras la celebración y experiencias pasadas, surgió la propuesta de invitar al cineasta y docente Andrés Pulido Esteve, quien está familiarizado con la naturaleza del programa, para la realización de su cortometraje Nadie recuerda este film utilizando home movies. Le planteé le propuse que celebráramos el Día del Cine Casero en el 2024, o sea, el año pasado, vinculando a sus alumnos de asignatura del Laboratorio de Investigación y Producción en Videoarte de la Licenciatura de Artes Visuales de la Facultad de Archivo de Artes y Diseño de la Universidad Autónoma de México. Los alumnos seleccionaron materiales del programa Archivo Memoria que les fueran de interés a través de la base de datos que está abierta online por si alguno de ustedes quiere visitarla. Y a partir de ello crearon un programa titulado La casa dentro de una cámara, conformado por 8 cortometrajes. Para esta presentación se seleccionaron y editaron 5 de ellos que veremos a continuación. Can you put, oh, thank you.
Si tú hubieras tenido una cámara de video, ¿qué cosas hubieras grabado desde hace 40 años? Si tuviera una cámara de video, de esas de video revolucionaria, que pudiera grabar imágenes de mis recuerdos, estos serían los que sin duda alguna me atrevería a grabar. Una imagen de la Gigi. La Gigi fue una perrita de raza pequinés. Ella llegó a mi vida cuando ambas éramos unas cachorras. Y bueno, de ella tengo innumerables recuerdos hermosos, pero hay una imagen que tengo de ella muy presente. Una tarde de mucho viento, yo la cargué y el viento movía sus orejitas, y cada que ella volteaba a un lado, a otro, el viento hacía de las suyas con sus orejas. Se sentía admirada por mí y así era. Esa imagen solo vive en mis recuerdos. Ella, de nombre Yolanda, tuvo una vida muy dura y su mirada se entristeció, pero cuando ella sonreía, su cara se iluminaba y sus ojos tomaban un brillo muy especial. Esas imágenes de cuando ella reía, esas veces eran muy contadas, y yo solo la miraba y decía, qué hermosa es mi mamá.
Dile, soy un pulpo, papi. Es un pulpo y mami es un lindo caracol. ¿Cómo se llama Sara?
Soy hermana mayor oficialmente desde el 22 de enero del 2003, pero se siente como si hubiera nacido siendo hermana mayor, porque fui la primera nieta mujer del lado de mi mamá y siempre se me habló como si yo fuera la mayor de algo, como que la que iniciaba algo en la familia. Entonces solo cuando llegó mi hermana sentí que se hizo oficial, pero en algún momento me preguntó mi mamá junto con su pareja, pero estaban hablando sobre el nombre de mi hermana. Ya para ese punto sabía que iba a ser niña y yo les dije que quería que se llamara Mariana. Yo tenía 10 años cuando mi hermana nació. Mi hermana y yo no somos hijas del mismo papá. Nunca sentí incomodidad, nunca sentí diferencias entre nosotras. Nunca fue algo realmente relevante entre nuestra experiencia, pues sí, entre ella y yo, entre mi hermana y yo. Hasta puedo pensar que el cuidado es como parte de la socialización de la mujer. No sé en qué momento lo aprendí, cómo lo internalicé en mi personalidad, pero se desarrolló y se desarrolló más cuando me di cuenta que nadie más nos cuidaba. Entonces, si yo no cuidaba a mi hermana, nadie más la iba a cuidar.
Te amo, mi vida. Y hola, hermanita.
Hola, tita.
Dile, ¿cómo estás?
Bien.
No, a ella pregúntale cómo estás.
Bien.
Dile, ¿cómo estás, hermanita?
Ya bien.
¿Estás dormida?
Sí, mira.
Está grabando tu hermano. Tu hermano va a ir así. Cuando termine de grabar.
Los pajarillos cantan, la luna ya se metió.
¿Recuerdas lo mucho que te gustaba bailar?
Tengo algunas cosas que decirte. ¿Hace cuánto que te fuiste de la casa? Cada mañana abro los ojos y ya no me encuentro en el mismo lugar. Ya no salimos a prisa de la casa y no me dices que tengo un buen día. Ya no me cuentas de tu vida ni yo te cuento de la mía, aunque me es difícil recordar si alguna vez lo hice. Cada mañana abro los ojos y pienso si debería acercarme a ti, y en el día me detona la memoria de lo que fue tu compañía. Veo los cerros y nos recuerdo derrapando en la tierra, y cuelgo medio cuerpo de la cama y pienso que si me dejo caer no habrá nadie con los brazos abiertos para atraparme. Abro los ojos y tengo 5 años, o menos, o más, y estás bajo la sombra de la noche, y por fin puedo dormir sabiendo que ya estás aquí. He roto relaciones con personas que me lastimaron y he llorado toda una semana en medio de un cuarto en blanco. Hice un proyecto que habla sobre ti y otros papás como tú, y tiene cartas y fotos de archivo. Es una camisa y está colgada en mi mueble de ropa, y todos los días la veo y pienso que extraño tus bromas, tus historias y las veces que me dijiste te quiero. No sé si esto es un perdón, pero no quiero seguirte odiando y me gustaría que te disculparas, y si algún día ves esto, esta es mi señal de paz, porque te extraño y a veces te sigo esperando.
The lights, please. Bueno, después de ver esto, los alumnos abordaron la idea del hogar como un espacio privado y de identidad social, y donde ellos plantearon la premisa que también llamamos hogar a nuestra ciudad, nuestro barrio o nuestro país. Así como que estamos inmersos con otro tipo de dinámicas sociales, de identidad y de paisajes. Y ante esto podemos entonces preguntarnos, ¿las películas caseras reflejan este entramado de ideas y sentimientos o se trata solo de la superficie de una idea del hogar? Este proyecto tiene el objetivo de reflexionar sobre estas y muchas otras preguntas en el marco del Home Movie Day. Y bueno, junto con Archivo Memoria, les funcionó como un espejo para reflexionar en torno al cine casero, pero también sobre todos aquellos conceptos vinculados con la identidad del hogar, la memoria, la familia, la infancia, la nostalgia y el deseo. Por una parte, este proyecto incentiva a los alumnos ante la gestión, reapropiación y acceso de materiales de una institución o archivo que les permitió explorar ideas personales por la naturaleza del mismo proyecto y las temáticas que se pueden albergar en él, ¿no? Verse reflejados ante estas filmaciones personales y poder ser un vínculo o puente introspectivo bajo la idea de que la familia da identidad social. En el programa Archivo Memoria se había solicitado material para su uso, sin embargo, en la mayoría de los casos tenía la función de contextualizar regiones en espacio y tiempo. Bueno, como reflexión de este proyecto, de los 8 cortometrajes, me parece importante resaltar que hay varias líneas de reflexión. La importancia de generar recuerdos de identidad y perpetuar la memoria, y que esto activó en varios de los alumnos interés por comenzar a procurar sus propios archivos familiares. Tal es el caso de la del primer video. La chica no tenía ningún archivo, solo fotos como aisladas de la perrita y así. Entonces, bueno, utilizó el material de archivo. Okay. Y ante esta ausencia de elementos, genera nuevas búsquedas para estas generaciones. Por otro lado, los que no contaban con material personal se dieron a la tarea de buscar videos, audios y poder integrarlos en sus cortometrajes. Me parece importante el reflejo más allá de lo personal a lo universal y la perspectiva de las madres solteras o padres ausentes que atraviesa el 40% de los hogares mexicanos, según datos del Instituto Nacional de Estadística y Geografía del 2024, el INEGI, así como la labor de cuidados que ejercen las mujeres. La ética con la que se acercan a los materiales de otras familias y hacer un vínculo con ellos. También invitamos a los donantes para que vieran el resultado de estos estudiantes y que estuvieran de acuerdo con ellos. Bueno, eso lo solicitamos antes, claramente. Y bueno, la estética, el sentido de movimiento, montajes, ritmos y colores, cada uno tuvo la libertad de hacer con los materiales diferentes narrativas, dobles exposiciones, animaciones y montajes de música compuesta por ellos o por otros artistas que les gustaban y accedieron a prestarles sus composiciones. Este proyecto permite que el material de archivos familiares funcione como un espejo catártico de reflexión ante la institución de la familia que condiciona a cada uno de ellos de diferente manera. Este puede ser el inicio de nuevos proyectos y queda abierta la invitación a colaborar con otras instituciones, archivos, artistas e instituciones educativas, a sumarse para seguir con esta iniciativa y poder compartirlo en Cineteca Nacional de México, donde también es un acercamiento e incentivo de ir de lo privado a lo público, así como vinculado con la experiencia de proyectarlo en una sala de cine grande, ¿no? Y que también sea una retribución social de acceso, difusión ante este patrimonio que preservamos en Cineteca. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Tania, por esta apasionante presentación que también pues, nos recuerda el papel de los archivos en cuanto a nuestro conocimiento de la sociedad y también en este papel de hacer, pues, de reflejar la visión a través del patrimonio. Y nos dejaremos las preguntas para después. Et maintenant, je vais introduire Erin Weisgerber, qui est une artiste montréalaise qui travaille sur la matérialité des pellicules, donc sur aussi tout leur aspect chimique, sur vraiment la question de la pellicule. Et je vais la laisser effectivement présenter son travail. Elle est membre du collectif Double Négatif. Et donc, c'est une cinéaste expérimentale, vous l'aurez compris. Merci.
So good afternoon. As was mentioned, I'm perhaps one of the few people here who's not an archivist or doesn't work in an archive. I'm an independent artist and filmmaker. And as you heard, my name is Erin Weisgerber, and I'd like to start with a story about that name, Weisgerber. So I grew up in the west of Canada on the prairies, and when you grow up in Canada, you are often asked, where do you come from? Right? Well, Edmonton. But where do you really come from? Edmonton. Well, what about your parents? Well, what about your grandparents? And they all came from Canada. I go back a few generations here in my family on both sides. But with the last name Weisgerber, people would often assume I was German. And we didn't know a lot about my father's side of the family, but we also know he grew up in a somewhat German-speaking context, not so much him or his parents, but people in his community. And so the answer was, well, I guess my father's side of the family is German. And when I was a teenager, someone found the name Weisgerber in the phone book and called us up and said he was doing our family tree and would like to meet us. So he came by, and I discovered that evening in my teens that actually my great-grandfather with his parents had immigrated to Canada, to what is now Canada, from the area around Odessa, in what is currently Ukraine. So there was this sort of story we were unaware of, and we could trace the family tree as far back as Alsace, where two brothers, Weisgerber, moved from Alsace to the area around Odessa. Later, as an adult, I was still sort of confused about this strange story, so I looked on my computer, did a little internet search with something very simple like Odessa and Germans, and discovered that indeed there were actually groups of Germans living around the Black Sea and around Odessa in particular, and they were called Black Sea Germans. And many of them, like my family, had moved to North America, particularly the Canadian province that's now Saskatchewan, had been Northwest Territories in the early 1900s, and the Dakotas. So why am I telling you this story? I do want to show you, of course, you're looking at a picture of Odessa, Saskatchewan. So it was very strange. My father grew up on a farm near this town, and so he'd visit it twice a year when I was a child to see my grandmother. And it was always a bit of a mystery why a Ukrainian port city would have a small town named after it on a very landlocked Canadian prairies. And it was because this group of what were called Black Sea Germans had moved there. Okay, so why is this a story that I'm sharing with you? Well, I was invited by the Cinémathèque Québécoise to create a new short film work using some Soviet film prints, a collection of features, trailers, some newsreels that had been donated by the collector François Lemay. And I really didn't know how I was going to engage with this collection of film prints. What do I have to do with the Soviet Union? How was I going to get in? And I had a few ideas, but I was going to need to see, and this was one of them, okay, maybe there's something to do with these Black Sea Germans, the Black Sea, Odessa. Maybe I can look around this geographical region, but I need to see what's in the collection. So sure enough, I found a film called The Swimmer, a Georgian film from 1981, and that featured the Black Sea heavily, obviously not around the area of Odessa, but I had my Black Sea, and I had this motif of a figure swimming. And those were going to start to be the ingredients that would make up the film. So I also started to have these sort of vague thematics around the idea of, or metaphorical ideas around a Black Sea, thinking about trying to look into history or into archives as something that's not solid, that's moving, that's shifting like a sea, and trying to create something, a solid story out of that that lack of solidity, and this idea of blackness as sort of obscurity, of trying to look into something and understand it. And then also these sort of imaginary spaces, micro-histories and migrations were all things going on in my head. And so I decided to take this film, as well as some shots from Alexandre Sokorov's film, The Lonely Human Voice, sometimes called The Lonely Voice of Man in English, from 1977. And those were images of landscapes, townscapes, nature, to try to create this imaginary space. Now that I had my material to work with and some thematics, I needed a process. So back in 2016, I had done an installation. Some of you will recognize that building, the Kodak Tower, where I worked with color separation. And it was, I used 3 cameras with 3 black and white film strips and projected them back through 3 projectors to create a full color image. And the idea for that project had come about after Kodak had announced its bankruptcy in 2012. And a lot of artists, and I'm sure many archivists and people working in restoration, were concerned about the reduced film stocks available to do our work on. And so I was looking back to some of these early color processes before there was an industrial cinema providing film stocks, and kind of playing with that idea. So for this film, I didn't want to do an installation, but a single channel film. So I decided to also take on a couple of other techniques that I hadn't explored in Minerva's Owl. Yeah, that's just color film. And think also about how color separation is used in archives. So starting with a color image, separating it onto 3 black and white film strips for their stability, and being able to bring those 3 colors, the red, green, and blue, back together. So I thought in this context of working with the Cinémathèque Québécoise, which has an archive, it was also interesting to play with an archival process, albeit in a very artistic, creative way, rather than one of preservation. So I decided to work also with creating my own film emulsion and with toning the film. Those were the other kinds of ingredients: color separation, handmade emulsion, film, and toning. So that's me making some very, very simple film emulsion using basic store-bought Knox gelatin, potassium bromide, and silver nitrate. Eventually, those 2 solutions would get mixed in the dark, or at least under a red safe light. And I should just note that I was relying a lot on work of artists and historians to be able to do this. So folks like those who are cited in this slide. We can see the book by Sarah Jones, Silver Gelatin, A User's Guide to Liquid Photographic Emulsions, but also that information was transmitted to me directly through the artists Robert Schaller and Alex McKenzie. And furthermore, in talking with the artist Lindsay McIntyre, who's worked a lot with making her own emulsion, with Esther Earlis in the Netherlands, whose sort of zine, Reinventing the Pioneers, I used. And the whole Maddox seminar of artists who were experimenting with making their own emulsions. And also I should mention the work of Mark Osterman, who was working for a long time at the George Eastman Museum, a process historian, who also was making this process of creating your own photographic film emulsion much more accessible for people. So it's a very slow film emulsion, about 3 ASA, and it's only blue sensitive, so it's not sensitive to a red light. That's some coating, the leader being ready to coat. Okay, so my first tests, my first experiments with using this emulsion. I don't know if, there we go. So you can see my first batch was not particularly successful. I had a lot of what turned out to be probably chemical fogging due to some error while I was making the emulsion. I'd let it get a bit too hot at one point. Maybe my timing of the mix was not very successful. So mostly I got just a lot of kind of this wavy black, and you could see every now and again an image would pop through as I was testing those exposures on my contact printer. I did then run a fog test and confirmed that indeed my film was fogged. So I'll let that play through. I also, as you can see, chose to show this with, you know, the frames above and below and the sprockets and everything, so you could see the entire film strip and what was happening. Okay, so I decided to do a second batch and try to correct my mistakes. And lo and behold, I got my first usable images, which was a relief because if I couldn't get a workable emulsion, then my whole technical procedural idea was not going to work. And those were images from a black and white negative I had already shot and not from the films. I wanted a known negative to work from to check the exposures. Okay, so now I had an emulsion that worked, and I was going to move on to the color separation stage. So I took a film from The Lonely Human Voice, or a shot from The Lonely Human Voice, and I copied it onto black and white negative film stock through red, green, and blue filters. And blue is over the image, interesting. And then I printed those to the black and white handmade emulsion and eventually triple exposed them on an optical printer to create a full color image. And that was the first time I could actually see what might happen when I tried to create color out of these black and white strips. So I'll start with the original shot so you can see what it was before I got to it. So the same shot printed to the film I had made with the emulsion I had made. Painted on with a foam brush, so that's where a lot of those bubbles are coming from. And my first chance to see it put all back together in color. Various combinations of exposure of the three colors and just overall exposure. As you can see, the results are fairly psychedelic, which was, I mean, I was going for something really variable that would really change the material. You know, I more or less got my wish here. But it did make it very hard to judge, like, well, what would be a good exposure? What's the right recombination of colors? That's subjective at this point. But I decided to try printing those negatives onto an industrial film stock that was going to give me something a little bit easier to judge the color recombination from, just as a reference for myself as I went forward. So this is that test on 3378E. So still fairly different from the original shot, but a little less of that psychedelia I was after. Okay, so now I had a film stock that worked. I knew I could make a color image, and the last step was to try to do that through toning the film. And I was using dye toning or mordant toning. First putting the film in a mordant bath that would transform the silver into a silver salt, and then into a dye toner that would attach to those silver salts, so the dark areas of the image would be colored. And the idea was eventually to tone the three strips, yellow, cyan, and magenta, or something approximating those colors, right? And tri-pack them together to get something, again, very much approximating the original color image. So those are a few of my tests. At the top, we can see that I was working with two different fixers, actually, when I originally processed the handmade film. So one of them had a commercially available hardening fixer, and the other one I used a non-hardening fixer that I mixed, knowing that it might be easier to tone the film if I had used a non-hardening fixer. The one that used a hardening fixer was left in a dehardener before I attempted the toning, and both strips spent the same amount of time in both the mordant, the wash, and the toning bath. And you can see that just that difference in the fixer created quite a different image, slightly different colors, but also reticulation, so that crackling started to appear, and very different patterns of reticulation between the commercial fixer and the non-hardening fixer. So one more in the shadow areas and one more in the highlights. And then below, I was using a red toner with two different mordant baths. So one that was going to produce silver ferrocyanide and one that was going to produce a silver iodide. And those led to slightly different colors, and still a bit of a ways off from the desired magenta color, more red. So I had a bunch of questions. I was really happy that my handmade emulsion didn't just lift off the film in the mordant, as I was afraid it might. I knew now it was a go. I could tone this film. So I didn't have to worry too much about its fragility. And now the question was playing with, which mordants to use, how long to leave the film in the mordants and the toners, what fixer to use, how to expose the film for this step. And I'll just show some slowed down clips that show this stuff in motion. I slowed them way down because they're very short clips. It says tinting, that's a lie, it's toning. So this was actually the fog test that I decided to throw in some cyan toner and left in the mordant for a really long time, creating all of this kind of cracking and reticulation that I found really beautiful. And these are the samples from the 4 stills that I showed. Okay, so I'll finish by saying that sort of this idea of playing with the 3-color separation process and this archival process, and some of these very simple, simple, I don't know if photographic emulsion is simple, but it's a simple photographic emulsion compared to what we're used to working with commercially. these were sort of just engines for discovering something, in that I'm obviously not trying to create a highly accurate reproduction. In fact, I'm trying to do the opposite. I'm trying to manipulate the image, to change it, and to leave space for variation and things that are unexpected. And along that process, any of the steps or any of the accidents are very welcome because they create the palette that I want to work from. So whether that's the fogged emulsion, that could be useful for something. Toning it, oh, that means my time is up. Reticulations, misregistration of the 3 color layers, using just one of the color channels, using the black and white, all of those are just some of the ingredients that can become part of the final film. And the next steps are to create that full color image using the toned film, and also to look into the Odessa archives, which do have information on those German, or actually documents from those German Black Sea German communities. And there's supposedly some microfilm in Ontario that I can check out. I think that's where I'll leave it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Erin. It was really, I think, enriching for all the archives to see this relationship, and also maybe how the artist can make the knowledge of the archive improve about the processes. Maybe I have a first question for you before everything, because I was so curious before all the other questions. It's about the documentation. How will you leave the documentation to the archive? I assume that maybe you will give the material one day, deposit it to an archive, but how do you leave all the constants of the process and the knowledge?
Ooh. You know, that's actually, we're lucky in Quebec that we have the Cinémathèque québécoise that at least does preserve our final works, our prints. A lot of artists in Canada do have that problem that we don't have archives that will preserve artists' work. But I haven't thought about, and I think a lot of us haven't thought too much about our processes and archiving those, and you know, sort of the elements along the way there. We keep them in rather messy cans in our studios, which I'm sure some archivists are very familiar with, and you're like, oh yeah, we know. But yeah, I haven't thought about preserving or archiving. I think we don't think of ourselves as, you know, particularly important to archive.
Yes, but in this case of this film, I think it's really an important thing to have the documentation, to understand what it is really that is behind the images. So yes, I encourage you to. But I imagine the Cinémathèque québécoise will do. So maybe I will first leave the floor for the questions, and then because there is a lot. I imagine you have, I don't know exactly the time we have, like 10-15 minutes, I imagine, for the questions. So 20 minutes?
15.
15, okay. Thank you.
Hello. For the first presentation, I'm Mikko Kuutti from Helsinki. Your presentation reminded me of a technical fact, that is, a technical detail that is very often ignored when restoring. I'm not an expert on the silent era technology, but at least since the academic aperture was standardized, there has been a standard on when you film with a camera and when you project, there are the apertures. So the camera aperture is much larger than the projection aperture to be able to hide any imperfections around the frame lines. So what happens is that when we've changed into the DCP era, this thing doesn't exist anymore. Most often, a DCP that we produce will be kind of projected in its entirety on the white screen. So there's no more cropping. Maybe some cropping on the sides where there are masks, but that also happened on top of the aperture masking in the film era. So what happens is that if the archivist doing the restoration cannot resist the allure of the whole negative frame, what happens is that you have extra things on the screen at all times. Because I think an archive should endeavor to produce the experience of the first screening, what the public saw, and that would have been on the screen. So what we should do in the case of DCPs is produce a DCP which has the image area of what would have been the projected image. And if you turn this into numbers, it means that we should always crop at about 4.5% of the image. And if you're talking about 4K, that amounts to 96 pixels out of 160 if we are talking about the height. So that's quite a lot. So my message to all of you is that do resist the temptation not to crop. And I'm afraid, even in my archive, this is very, it is not happening. We cannot resist the temptation. But this also leads to the amusing fact that if you ever see a rounded corner when a new restored silent film is projected, it has been produced wrongly. So thank you.
Yeah, it's an important issue. You say that it's really important to keep the format of the projected image, and it's an issue we had with 16mm films recently from avant-garde Czech films. Actually, that we have the projection. It's actually like not 1.37, neither 1.33, but 1.30. Like 338, so we decided to have 33 in order to not to have a teeny. But it's important to keep. We had to crop something that was not projected and cannot be projected by any 16mm projectors, even if like the norm is the norm, but also like apparatus can be a little bit different. So, but it's important, yes, you're right to but. We sometimes we have the director on the edge and should be cropped.
And I would also add one thing, that it's not just about cropping, and it is actually in the whatever is the chapter of the digital dilemma, 5 or 3 dedicated to this ethical things. There is in some archives and in many studios, unfortunately, the cult of the camera negative, which leads to not only uncropped things, but which leads to extremely sharp images. And this is why we get all of those Technicolor prints. I mean, you can grade it more or less appropriately nowadays if you have original prints as a reference, but you will never get the right softness if you just scan this with the camera negative. And that's something which is extremely difficult to. There, the temptation is extremely strong because it's so nice and pristine, and the print's all beaten up and scratched. That, I think, is, I wouldn't say it's more problematic, but it's as problematic. But indeed, you're pointing out the very important thing, that we should think about what was seen on the screen. And resist the temptation not to blur. Not to blur, exactly. And then we can always start, degrade and regrain, yeah. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Gregory Luco, retired from the Library of Congress. Peter and Jeanne, again, following up on your presentation. Peter, I first learned of FIAF's new ethics, Code of Ethics initiative when I was reading that article earlier this month in which you were quoted in the Brooklyn Rail. It had the headline, "Long Live Film Restoration," and the subheadline, "Film Restoration is Dead." You can look it up. It's Peter is quoted in it, I'm quoted in it, others are quoted in it. It's one of a series of such articles. But when I read your formulation, your simple formulation, restoration is not creation, my mind wandered immediately to UCLA's, and I look at my two UCLA colleagues sitting right in front of me, restoration back in 1985 of the first two-strip Technicolor feature film, The Toll of the Sea, which would have made a wonderful example in your presentation because the last reel, I think, of it was missing, and the last shots were of lapping waves in a sunset over the Pacific Ocean. Now, UCLA's restorationist at the time was Bob Gitt, and he was collaborating with the late Pete Comandini, who was one of the two co-owners of YCM Laboratories, who UCLA worked with a great deal in the 1980s. And Pete Comandini had an original two-strip Technicolor camera, and they went out to the Pacific Ocean beach, and they reshot lapping waves and the sunset over the Pacific Ocean. It was a brilliant, and they called attention to it. They didn't try to hide it. So when I was reading at your code of ethics, the 1.4 paragraph used the term, I forget, attempt to strive to complete or attempt to complete. The word complete popped out at me. And then you didn't repeat that 1.4 paragraph as you continued with your paragraphs. It was all about creation. But the urge to create versus the urge to the urge to complete, but not the urge to create, is a really interesting balance that The Toll of the Sea, I thought, really intriguingly illustrates. It's a comment with a question mark at the end, just as your paper began with a question mark at the end.
Yeah, the current code of ethics is saying that the archives will endeavor to complete what is incomplete, or only to complete.
The current one, not the proposed one.
But it was reformulated exactly for the reason that you say that should not be like a goal for the restoration to complete what is incomplete.
And the thing is, I mean, it's as Jeanne mentioned earlier, it's not that archives can never be creative. To give you an example about completing the incomplete, there are, for example, unfinished films, like, I don't know, like some of Orson Welles' films, and I mean, Stefan Rosler worked on a number of them. There is the Eisenstein's Mexican film that was done by so many archives. The film was never completed. There is no way you can restore. There is nothing to restore. So you can either just show multiple takes forever and put them online, which is a possibility, or you can have an attempt of editing the material, but it is clearly, it could never, ever, ever be called either a restoration or a reconstruction. It's a creation, it's a construction, you know, and it's not a crime, but the definitions are very important here. It's actually, there are fascinating examples of what archives can do, but it's just, it's something different. It's not a restoration.
And this one was particularly convincing, this example. I remember it pretty well, the waves and the technology. It's interesting also experience to reconstruct the technologies used for a film. It's an interesting experiment and very clearly said in the restoration card at the beginning of the film, actually.
I have a question for Tanya. Can I ask the question in English?
Yes.
My
sure.
Spanish, it would be terrible.
In English.
I was interested in and it's also a personal interest, in the collection of film, the home movies you're working with. They're essentially films shot locally for the most part. Yeah. Do you also have a lot of films? This is something that I've always been interested in home movies, is that a lot of them are shot locally, sometimes, you know, Mexicans, for instance, going abroad. But if there was an international connection between, for instance, films shot in Mexico, I have a couple that are wonderful of Mexico City in the 50s, for instance, really wonderful home movies. Is this something that is also something that you would be interested in collaborating with other, you know, either in home movies in Bologna or other places? Is this something that you're? Is this something that could bring something new to the work with the creative work that you and your team are doing?
Yeah, we haven't done that yet, but we are open to do that because some people also migrate to Mexico, or they go to Brazil or to other countries, and they film while they live there, and they return to Mexico City and continue the collection, no, like the filming and the family stuff. And yeah, we do have that type of home movies on travel-offs and everything, but we haven't had the opportunity to grow this collection more into other archives or to other families around the world. But it will be like a good start.
I had myself a little question. The last one for Tanya, and it's very short. It's about the video, because I saw that there is some images are not Super 8 or 8mm, but are videos in the film. So how do you collect video home movies, because it's quite new and few archives are doing it?
Yeah, these videos were from the families, the kids, well, the students, that they research from their own personal family archive. But in Cineteca, we don't have that yet, because it's a humongous space also for the vaults, and the digital space and everything. It demands another type of preservation. So for now, it's just for films, and then I don't know. We'll see if at some point it will be like it's like clicking. No, the time is clicking all the time. But for now, I think it's better to, well, no, not better. It's not that it's better or not, but we don't have like those facilities now for that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So I think the time of this session is ending. So thank you very much to all of you.
So we have like 15 minutes for a shorter pause than this morning. And you know that there's some exposants, exhibitors downstairs. They are waiting for you guys. See you in 15 minutes. Donc dans 15 minutes, on se retrouve ici. Merci.